I'm really interested in what communities produce. All texts are products of communities.
Erica, it's very nice to see you here, and thank you for taking the time to do this interview with me. My first question would be, how did you get into Oriental studies, to use an old term?
Well, it's a long time ago. When I was a very young girl, we had very hot summer's evenings in Australia, and I wanted to sleep outside in the garden. And my mother would say to me, Erica, you can't sleep in the garden. A boogeyman will take you to the Middle East. Now, that's probably completely politically incorrect, but it's whetted my appetite. Middle East. So I read everything I could about the Middle East. When I got to going to university, I decided that I would do something in the Middle East. I had really wanted to do Mesopotamian archaeology, but that was simply unavailable in Australia. It just wasn't available. So I opted to read Semitic languages, Hebrew, Arabic, and then Aramaic. And I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Melbourne in Victoria, Australia, and then also my postgraduate degree, including my doctorate. After that, I had the chance, I got a tiny little fellowship to go to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So I went, and it was a fabulous experience. World-class teachers who were also very generous with their time. And when I was there, I met the then Regius Professor of Hebrew, John Emerton, who read my thesis, and we talked about Syriac and we talked about other matters. And he said to me, would you like to come to Cambridge? And that was beyond my wildest dreams, but I did come to Cambridge.
Okay, and so what did you do here?
Well, I of course arrived in a very small research capacity. I started to publish because, of course, I hadn't published whilst writing my thesis. And then I applied to the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, the then British School of Archaeology, to go to Iraq to look at their incantation bowls in the Iraq Museum. Now, that was a product of one summer's afternoon here in the then Oriental faculty, when John Emerton brought out a rather handsome, large pottery bowl which had Aramaic writing on, a real paleographic challenge, and said, Erica, how would you like to publish this? And so I set about. I'd never seen an incantation bowl, but I set about, and it really was a paleographic challenge. Writing was very faint, but we did. So I started to think about incantation bowls, and I knew that there were half a dozen in the Iraq Museum. So I applied and got this little grant to go, and off I went to Baghdad.
Okay, and how long were you there?
Well, I arrived in December 1987, just at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. Everyone thought I was Majnoon or mad in Arabic. All my friends thought, she'll never come back. And I was there for a few months initially, and then I got further funding from the British school, the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, and I only left Iraq in 1991 in the summer. The Gulf War hadn't been declared. One always came back to the UK for the summer because it was too hot to work in Iraq, and of course the Gulf War came.
Okay, and what happened in Iraq while you were there?
Well, I had the best years of my life, fantastic years, fabulous amounts of material. I came to see 6 incantation bowls. You had to ask for permission for published specimens only, in any category. It had to be published specimens. And so I wrote and said I wanted to see these 6 specimens, and they came. I got on really well with the Iraq Museum. the girls that brought up the stuff, hairdos and fashion I talked about, and they loved it. They kept bringing me the stuff. So I realised that there was a lot of material. I telephoned London. In those days you telephoned and told them what was happening, and they had the wisdom to say, stay. If you can stay, stay. Then one Christmas, I can't remember, it might have been 1988, the the American ambassadress, April Glaspie, had a cocktail party, and the director of antiquities was there, and we got on famously having cocktails, and I talked to him about my research, which he hadn't been aware of. So 2 days later, I got a summons to go to his office, and I was a bit terrified that perhaps I'd said something I shouldn't have said. And I got there, and he said, Dr. Erica, we don't have any experts working in your languages, Aramaic, Syriac and Mandaic, all dialects of Aramaic. How would you like to publish our entire collection? I mean, that was a phenomenal offer. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, of course. You don't hesitate. You don't say, oh, well, I'll think about it. With the Iraqis, you say yes or no. You don't. So I said, yes, I will. I said, when would you like me to start? And he said, tomorrow. And how many research assistants would you like? So I had 2 fabulous assistants, Ahmed Kamil, who was a Kurd, very fine archaeologist, and Nadia, who was a Mandaean, and I could read the language of her people, which the laity don't read the language. So that is how I started. And in that year, I drew and recorded all the details. You know, it was basically cataloguing the material. 350 items out of the total collection, which was 700 items. And that collection had never been known before, and it is still the largest collection in the world.
Nice. And then you had to leave Iraq, right?
Well, I came back because I always came back for the May balls. I was a bit keen on the May balls. And as I said, we didn't stay, the British didn't stay for the summer in Iraq. You couldn't do field work, so they closed up the house. I mean, Baghdad's 55 degrees Celsius daily. You just can't work in that. But you'd go back in September. So I fully expected to go back in September 1991, and the Gulf War came. Saddam invaded Kuwait in August of that year, and the rest is history. We couldn't go back. But when I was here, so I still received my small stipend from the British Institute, which of course was quite a challenge to live in the UK on, but there you are, I still had it. And I spoke to a couple of scholars who were working on large collections of incantation bowls, and one was J.B. Seagull, who was formerly at SOAS, and he was publishing the British Museum collection. So I thought, well, I'll pick his brain, see how he's publishing it, because I've got this big collection to publish, and we'll see, you know. And I spoke with him, and he said, how would you like to join me on the British Museum publication? Well, that was fabulous, and so I did join him. So 92 and 93 were involved in getting that ready for publication, and he was in his 80s, so I know that the input that I had, just the 2 of us working together, meant that publication was realised, and he was 90 when it was published. So scholars keep going, but it was published in the year 2000. Okay. By the British Museum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what happened to you?
Well, 92, 93, 95, I joined the Taylor Schechter Geniza research unit with my reading skills, working with Stefan Reif here in the Cambridge University Library. and looking at all the manuscripts. And that was a fabulous training for manuscripts, how to deal with manuscripts, just all the aspects, because of course I had not worked with manuscripts before. I'd been working with pottery, and it's a very different fabric and medium. So I worked with that, with Stefan and all sorts of things. And that was a great time, and he was a terrific person to work with. If I said to him, Stefan, the Iraqis have asked me to come to Iraq, he'd say, go. He was really great, and he recognised research. So I worked in the Geniza for 2 full years, and then I went to Manchester. John Healy, whom I'm still a good colleague of mine, he was taking a sabbatical, and I stepped into his shoes for the year at Manchester, which was my first introduction to teaching and administration, and it was a baptism of fire. The administration, we had a QAA, people probably don't know what that is, but a major review, and you had to prepare everything. But it was great, and I loved the teaching, but of course it was only a year because John was on sabbatical, and then I went back to the Geniza. I had a telephone call one afternoon in 2000, and it was a colleague of mine at SOAS, and it was rather sad. He had personal circumstances that led him to resign overnight, and they needed someone to teach Syriac. So I got this telephone call, would I come down and teach Syriac for a couple of hours a week, just Syriac. So I asked Stefan, I said, Stefan, can I go? He said, fine, you make up the time on a Saturday or whenever you go off for the afternoon. That's my introduction to SOAS.
Okay. And so how long were you at SOAS in the end?
Well, I retired in 2020. So I started in a tiny capacity. I never envisaged. But at the end of the first year, and I just taught Syriac the way I would always taught it, as I taught here, and I taught Aramaic here in the faculty, so I taught it at SOAS, and at the end of that, it was only a semester, it was in January, and of course so it was only half a year, and SOAS asked me, would I like to teach further courses, and so I said yes. So for a while I taught that as well as being at the Geniza. It was quite a full schedule, I will say, but it's always experience. It gives you different dimensions. Then I went back to Manchester in 1992 to 1993 because John had also another sabbatical, John Healy. So I came back to Manchester. I liked Manchester. Manchester was a very good university. And then after that, I didn't go back to the Geniza, but I had started to build my connections with SOAS, and I stayed there till 2020.
No, quite recently.
Yeah, until COVID, yeah.
That's, the COVID thing.
Yes, yeah. Yes. Well, there were other reasons too, but essentially SOAS, I mean, it was right in the middle of COVID. And actually it was the right time to retire. I didn't want all the new innovations that were going on. But I had a great time at SOAS in the fact that I could develop areas that I didn't develop here. So because when I was in Iraq, I realised that there were living communities of the manuscripts that I had read as an undergraduate and studied as a postgraduate. I used to go to church with them every Sunday. I worshipped with them. I understood that and was embraced into the communities. So when I was at SOAS, I developed the modern dimension, and that was really also in response to the shocking circumstances that hit Iraq and hit all of her people, but particularly the smaller communities. So I felt that it was really necessary to show people that there were these modern communities. I also developed the Tour de Fan connection.
So can you tell us about the Tour de Fan collection?
Well, again,
because that actually connects to my own research.
Well, that's right. Again, it was a small comment. I was at a conference in Berlin in 2002, and Peter Ziemer, who was then the director of the Tour de Fan Forschung, and I can remember where we were standing, and he said, "Erika, why don't you publish our Syriac manuscripts from Tour de Fan?" And I thought, well, that's a good idea, but I really didn't have the wherewithal at that stage. But I had a very promising doctoral student, Mark Dickens, who of course has made his mark in the field, and Mark has made his mark. And when he finished his doctorate, I thought, I've got to find him something. You know, he's got a family, he's got to earn. So I thought about a Syriac catalogue, what Peter Ziemer had said, but I couldn't do it myself. And I was around seeing Nicholas Sims Williams, and I was standing in his kitchen with him talking, and I say, "Oh, I'm going to do a Syriac catalogue with Mark Dickens for the Arts and Humanities Research Council funding." And he said, "Well, that's interesting, because I'm going to do a Sogdian one." So we joined forces on the spot. We roped in Peter Ziemer for the Uyghur, and that's how the catalogues developed. That was our first major research grant, and it was absolutely necessary, because Nicholas did know his Sogdian material extremely well, but the Syriac material was only surface scratched. So we catalogued that. And then I got a subsequent grant to work on one of the major grants. So I basically had material on Tour de Fan, or grants on Tour de Fan, from 2008 to 2015. So my colleagues at SOAS weren't so pleased, because I opted out of teaching and administration. Not all, but quite a lot. But it meant that we established a platform for Syriac studies and Christianity at Tour de Fan.
And just looking at your research in retrospect, do you see some big turning points, or can you think about the development, the arch?
Well, I think I have developed various areas. Tour de Fan is a natural one. And I do like development. I think it's really important to start to look at broad holes and think about, obviously you have to have all the ground. Tour de Fan has been one. I think my work on incantation bowls has also developed new arenas, because I looked at various aspects that other scholars didn't look at. They were very much fixated with just reading text and philological comment. Now that is important, but I really haven't developed that in my research publications as much as I would like to, and I shall do. All sorts of other questions about how these objects reflect communities. I'm really interested in what communities produce. All texts are products of communities. But you often find an almost mathematical treatment of them. To me, what is the living genius behind a text is the person or the community who wrote it, or the communities that used it. So I've been very interested in to open up this broad area with Tour de Fan, looking at the Christian heritage of Tour de Fan and its connection with Mesopotamia. I think that's probably the major development, but other developments are, I've worked on Syriac amulets, incantation bowls, and the whole repertoire, what we might call vernacular religion, which when I was an undergraduate was definitely infra-dig. Mm-hmm. My last supervisor, because I had three, I went through one a year, my last supervisor was completely antithetical to my thesis topic. But I thought vernacular literature is extremely important. It's not just Bible studies. They are important, of course, but vernacular literature. So that's my sort of passion, is communities. And I would say that's the overarching theme. What are the products of communities? How do they reflect the communities?
Okay. And so where were the turning points for you in your career? So were there specific points which kind of propelled you?
Well, I think it was the invitations to do material. I mean, perhaps it says something about me. I had someone who said, why don't you do this? And I had Professor Emerton, John Emerton, Peter Zima, who said, why don't you do this? But I also then thought about it and took up the challenge. So, and I also wanted to develop areas away from very traditional approaches which still dominate Syriac studies. And they are turning away. So in a way, I think I had that drive, but perhaps the impetus came from someone who said, well, why don't you look at this? And I thought, yes, why don't I look at that and develop it from there?
So you could call these opportunities, but you have to have been the right person for the opportunity, probably.
We get presented with opportunities and you have to take them. I've always been the person that will pick up an opportunity. For example, when I was in Iraq, the Oriental Institute were excavating at Nippur, a very famous site, and they found incantation bowls. And I said to Maguire Gibson, who was the director, I said, I'll read them for you and I'll publish it. And that actually opened an entirely new dimension in incantation bowls, because they had never been found in situ, and we could now, there'd always been surface finds or whatever, but now we had the archaeological context. To me, an object is grounded in its archaeological context. It tells you so much. And so I could extrapolate on sociological questions about these bowls, etc. But Maguire was there, and I just said to him, that was one case. Of course, I had already got the incantation stream in my research profile. And I said, look, I'll publish them. And he said, yes, please, do go ahead. So you get opportunities and you take them.
Okay. And looking at sort of the younger generation, early career scholars, what would be your advice to them? Because we see them struggling, right? Getting jobs and moving forward, publishing, balancing personal lives and careers.
Well, I always look for a sense of commitment, and it is very difficult. I know myself how difficult it was. You have to be flexible too, and that is why I've developed different areas too. When the opportunity comes, you say yes, and you always learn something. I mean, I learnt from all my different small posts, etc. I always learnt something and it added. The Ghanese had taught me how to handle manuscripts for Tour de Fan, etc. So I think you have to be flexible, you have to be committed, and unfortunately you have to know that there are going to be tough times. And if I say so, I don't want to be, dismal, but I often felt that I was climbing Mount Everest, sort of clawing at rocks which were crumbling in my hand and trying to climb. But you have the passion, and you just have, that's what propels you. You're interested, you want to do something. And it is very, very difficult, I know. And you have to be lucky, and I was a bit lucky too.
Yeah, luck.
Serendipity isn't extremely important. I mean, I met these people, but also I took up what they said. I mean, I could have said to the Director of Antiquities, I'll come back next year. Well, I'd never been there in Iraq. If you didn't take it up that day, it wasn't there tomorrow. So you have to you have to look at the area, keep working on it, be flexible too, and all sorts of little jobs that are connected, editing or whatever. That all adds up to your experience.
Okay. And also thinking about these new finds that are happening at the moment, what do you think the right way to tackle them? So, because they're in China, and at the moment or during the COVID, we had very little access to them, right? So what do you think the next 5 or 10 years of this kind of research is going to be? Or what would be the right way to do it?
I always say to people, and I'm very aware of working and understanding what people in a country can offer you. When I was in the Iraq Museum, the Iraqis, I have to say, often came into me to discuss their finds because I was approachable and I was interested. I realised they understood certain aspects that a European didn't understand, but they understood things. So it was a mutual collaboration. For me, with the Chinese, with their manuscripts, what European scholars like myself can do is contribute what we know from Tour de Fan in Berlin, and if willing to sort of match manuscripts, etc. I do think that the publishing rests with the Chinese. It is their cultural heritage, although it is distinctly Mesopotamian, but it is the cultural heritage of China. But asking advice from other people is always valuable because you get a different perspective, and we can learn as much from them as they can from us. But I think that's how I would view it, is offering what we have in Berlin, where the collections are held, and seeing what comment we can make on what new material is found at Tour de Fan. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what's happened at Tour de Fan, the excavation, and any reports that may be published.
Yeah. And this field of Syriac studies, like focusing on the Christian heritage, is really kind of transcultural or trans-regional, right?
Yeah.
Because they're all over Central Asia, from West Asia all the way to China.
Well, it's a mega dimension, and that, I think I can say, I have contributed to the opening up of a field that was really focused on Syria, Turkey, and a little bit of northern Iraq. I've done a lot of work in southern Iraq too, which most Syriac scholars really don't, because the evidence isn't so great as in the north. And the whole transcultural aspect of the Church of the East, which had a fantastic spread and interacted with different ethnic and linguistic communities. And that's a message for us all, and it is a fabulous story. And I know that there is a much greater interest and excitement about that field, and I hope that will continue.
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, my pleasure, Imre. Always a pleasure to talk in a faculty that holds many memories and has created many opportunities for me.
Very good. For me too.
Yeah.
Of course. Thank you very much.
No.
Okay.